Lisa peeked out from the kitchen, her expression anxious. "They're back," Mac muttered from his seat near the window. His voice was calm, but his hands clenched into fists. Ray stood up, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "Stay where you are," he said to Jimmy and the others. "Let's see what they're planning." The Iron Serpents rolled into the parking lot, their bikes lined up in a menacing formation. Blade was at the front, his leather jacket glinting in the sunlight. He dismounted with a smirk, his crew following suit. The gang moved with purpose, their swagger more pronounced than before. Inside the truck stop, the tension was palpable. The patrons watched as the bikers approached, their expressions a mix of anger and apprehension. Lisa gripped the counter, her knuckles white. Pete glanced at Ray, silently seeking reassurance. Ray gave a small nod, his calm demeanor steadying those around him. "Just remember," he said quietly, "we're stronger together." Blade pushed open the door with a loud creak, his smirk widening as he took in the room. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like we're back by popular demand." No one responded. The silence was heavy, the truckers' collective resolve evident in their stony expressions. Blade's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. He stepped further into the diner, his boots clunking against the tiled floor. "Now I know we got off on the wrong foot yesterday," Blade said, his tone mockingly friendly. "So we thought we'd swing by and clear the air." Ray stepped forward, his calm but commanding presence drawing the bikers' attention. "You've said enough. Turn around and leave." Blade raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "Not much of a welcoming committee, are you?" Ray didn't budge. "This isn't your playground. You're not welcome here." The bikers exchanged glances. "Him here." The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly under the weight of Ray's unflinching stare. But Blade wasn't about to back down. He stepped closer to Ray, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You really think you can tell us what to do?" Ray's response was calm but firm. "I don't need to. You already know you don't belong here." Blade chuckled, though the sound lacked conviction. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that." Before Ray could respond, Tank stepped forward, his massive frame looming over the room. "We didn't come here to chat," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We came to settle the score." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. The truckers, seated at various tables, began to rise, their movements slow and deliberate. Mac, Jimmy, and Frank positioned themselves near Ray, their expressions unyielding. Pete retreated to the counter, his hand hovering near the phone, ready to call for help if things escalated. Blade noticed the shift and sneered. "What's this? A little army of truckers? You think you can take us on?" Ray didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the weight of the truckers' silent solidarity speak for itself. Finally, he said, "You have two choices. Walk away or regret staying." Blade's smirk twisted into a scowl. "You've got a lot of nerve." Ray took a step closer, his voice steady. "And you've got a lot to lose." For a moment, the room was still, the tension crackling like electricity. Blade glanced around, taking in the unyielding faces of the truckers. It was clear he was outnumbered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. Finally, he raised his hands and mocked surrender. All right, we'll play nice." The truckers didn't relax, their stance unchanging as the bikers backed away slightly. Blade's eyes flicked toward Ray, his expression a mix of anger and grudging respect. "But don't think this is over," he said, his tone dark. "We'll be back." Ray didn't flinch. "We'll be here." The bikers lingered for a moment longer, their defiance hanging in the air. Then, one by one, they turned and left, their heavy boots echoing through the diner. As the door swung shut behind them, the truckers exchanged relieved glances. "Think they'll actually stay away this time?" Jimmy asked, his voice low. Ray shook his head. "No, but next time they'll learn just how strong this community really is." The Iron Serpents roared out of the parking lot, their bikes kicking up gravel as they disappeared down the highway. Inside the diner, the tension slowly began to ease. The truckers returned to their seats, but their eyes kept darting toward the door, wary of what might happen next. Lisa set down a fresh pot of coffee with shaking hands, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Pete approached Ray cautiously, wiping his hands on a rag. "Do you think they're gone for good this time?" he asked, his voice betraying his nerves. Ray shook his head. "Not likely. Men like that don't know when to quit." Pete sighed, leaning against the counter. "I don't know how you stay so calm. If it were up to me, I'd have called the cops by now." Ray offered a faint smile. "Sometimes it's better to handle things yourself. Cops might escalate the situation and we don't need that." Jimmy chimed in from the booth he'd claimed. "Besides, I don't think those guys are looking for anything legal. They want to prove something. Make sure we remember them." Mac, who had been quietly sipping his coffee, finally spoke up. "They want to scare us, but they don't understand. Truckers look out for each other. Always have, always will." His words seemed to resonate with everyone in the room. Heads nodded in agreement, and the uneasy silence began to dissipate. Even Lisa managed a small smile as she refilled Mac's cup. Still, Ray couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Blade's parting words had been more than an idle threat. They carried a promise of something darker, and Ray knew better than to underestimate a man like that. He glanced out the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Meanwhile, several miles down the road, the Iron Serpents had pulled into an abandoned lot, their bikes forming a semicircle as they gathered to discuss their next move. Blade stood in the center, pacing back and forth as his crew watched him with a mix of frustration and unease. "We didn't come this far to be humiliated by a bunch of truckers," Blade growled. His fists clenched at his sides. Tank leaned against his bike, arms crossed. "So what's the plan, boss? We can't just roll back in there without a strategy." Blade stopped pacing and turned to face his crew. "We don't need a strategy. We need to remind them who we are. We go back tonight, and we show them why nobody messes with the Iron Serpents." Razor, the wiry and often skeptical member of the group, raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Those guys didn't look like they were gonna back down. And that old man? He's tougher than he looks," Blade sneered. "He's just an old man trying to act tough. We'll put him in his place." The rest of the gang murmured their agreement, though some of them exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear not everyone was fully on board with Blade's obsession, but none of them dared to challenge him outright. Back at the truck stop, Ray and the others began preparing for the possibility of another confrontation. Max suggested locking the doors, but Pete shook his head. "We've never locked up before, and we're not starting now. This place is open to everyone." "Well, almost everyone," Jimmy smirked. "Almost," he echoed. Ray, however, wasn't taking any chances. He quietly organized the truckers, making sure everyone knew what to do if the Iron Serpents returned. "We don't want to provoke them," he said, "but we don't let them intimidate us either." Mac nodded. "What about Lisa and Sarah?" "They shouldn't be out here if things go south," Pete agreed. "I'll keep them in the back if it comes to that." The plan was simple, but effective. The truckers would hold the line, and the staff would stay out of harm's way. Ray made it clear that violence was a last resort, but everyone knew the Iron Serpents wouldn't come back for a friendly chat. As the day wore on, the truck stop returned to a semblance of normalcy. Regular customers filtered in and out, oblivious to the tension that had gripped the place just hours earlier. Ray stayed vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the parking lot. The other truckers followed his lead, their quiet resolve a testament to the strength of their community. By the time the sun began to set, the atmosphere in the diner had grown heavier. Pete locked eyes with Ray as he refilled a salt shaker. "You think they'll come back tonight?" Ray nodded. "If they're coming back, it'll be after dark." Lisa overheard and froze mid-step, her face pale. Sarah put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she said gently. "We've got Ray and the others. Nothing's going to happen to us." Lisa nodded, though her unease was evident. She glanced out the window, the darkening sky only adding to her anxiety. "I just wish this was over," Pete sighed. "You're not the only one." As night fell, the truckers began to settle into their positions. Ray remained by the counter, his posture relaxed, but his senses sharp. Jimmy and Mac sat at a nearby table, chatting casually but ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Pete kept a close eye on the door, his usual jovial demeanor replaced with quiet determination. Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycles broke the silence. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. The truckers exchanged knowing glances, their calm expressions masking the tension that gripped the room. "They're here," Mac said quietly. Ray stood up, his movements deliberate. "Stay calm," he said. "We'll handle this." The Iron Serpents pulled into the parking lot, their bikes forming a menacing line in front of the truck stop. Blade dismounted first, his smirk more pronounced than ever. Tank and the others followed, their swagger a clear attempt to intimidate. Inside, the truckers rose to their feet one by one, their unity a silent but powerful statement. Ray stepped forward, his gaze locked on Blade as the gang leader pushed open the door. "Well," Blade said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Looks like we're back." Blade stepped into the diner, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. The rest of the Iron Serpents followed close behind, their intimidating presence filling the room. Blade's smirk widened as he surveyed the truckers, who stood silently, their faces unreadable. His gaze eventually landed on Ray, who stood calmly at the counter, unmoving. "Still playing the hero, old man," Blade said, his voice laced with mockery. "I thought you'd have learned your lesson by now." Ray didn't respond immediately. He simply met Blade's gaze with quiet confidence. Finally, he said, "You've got no business here. Turn around and leave while you still can." Blade chuckled, shaking his head. "You just don't get it, do you? This isn't about business. This is about making sure you and your little friends understand who's in charge." Tank stepped forward, his massive frame looming over the nearest truckers. "Yeah, we're done playing nice." Jimmy took a step closer to Ray, his jaw set. "You weren't playing nice to begin with," Tank sneered. "And what are you gonna do about it?" Mac's voice cut through the tension. "Whatever it takes." The other truckers nodded in agreement, their united front unwavering. Blade's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, his bravado returning in full force. He turned to Ray, his tone turning colder. "You think you can scare us with your little trucker army? We've taken down bigger groups than this." Ray stepped forward, his calm demeanor never wavering. "This isn't about scaring you, it's about stopping you." Blade scoffed. "Stopping us? You think you're a big-shot vigilante now?" Ray shook his head. "No, just a man who won't stand by and let bullies like you run wild." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Ray's words hanging in the air. The truckers remained steady, their resolve unshaken. Blade, however, was not one to back down easily. He glanced at his crew and nodded. The Iron Serpents spread out, their movements deliberate. Tank knocked over a chair as he moved toward the center of the room, while Razor began rifling through a rack of menus near the door. Another biker, a wiry man nicknamed Ghost, tapped his fingers on the counter, his expression bored but watchful. Pete, who had been quietly observing from behind the counter, tightened his grip on the phone. Ray noticed the movement and gave him a subtle shake of his head. "Not yet," he said softly. Lisa and Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, their faces pale but determined. Sarah placed a protective arm around Lisa's shoulders, whispering words of reassurance. "It'll be okay," she said. "Ray's got this." Blade sauntered closer to Ray, his smirk returning. "You know, you've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far." Ray remained still, his calm presence unwavering. "And threats only get you so far." Blade's smile faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Ray took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "Neither do you." The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Blade clenched his fists, his frustration evident. The rest of the Iron Serpents exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that their leader's bravado was starting to crack. Tank, always eager to escalate a situation, stepped toward Mac, his expression challenging. "You got something to say, old man," Tank growled. Mac didn't flinch. "Just wondering when you're gonna realize you're out of your league." Tank let out a low chuckle, his fist tightening. "Big talk for a guy who looks like he's ready to keel over." Jimmy moved to stand beside Mac, his stance firm. "If you're looking for a fight, You're not gonna like how it ends." Blade turned his attention to the growing standoff, his irritation boiling over. "Enough of this," he barked. "We didn't come here to listen to your pathetic speeches." Ray's voice was calm but firm. "Then why are you here? To make fools of yourselves again?" Blade's expression darkened. "We're here to settle the score, and we're not leaving until we do." Ray took another step forward, his voice steady. "You already lost. You just haven't figured it out yet." Blade sneered, his fists tightening. "Oh, I've figured it out, and I'm about to show you just how wrong you are." The iron serpents began to close in, their movements deliberate. The truckers stood their ground, their unity unshaken. Pete's hand hovered over the phone, his instincts screaming at him to call for help, but Ray's calm resolve kept him rooted in place. The room felt like a powder keg, seconds away from exploding. Blade's frustration turned to anger, and he raised his fist, ready to strike. But before he could make his move, Ray spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This is your last chance," Ray said. "Walk away now and no one gets hurt." Blade froze, his fist still raised. For a moment, it seemed like he might listen, but then he lowered his hand, his smirk returning. "You're lucky I'm feeling generous," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He turned to his crew and nodded toward the door. "Let's go." The iron serpents hesitated, but ultimately followed Blade's lead, their earlier bravado giving way to quiet frustration. One by one, they filed out of the diner, their footsteps heavy with unspoken resentment. Blade paused at the door, glancing back at Ray. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't over." Ray's response was calm and measured. "It is if you want it to be." Blade didn't reply. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, his crew close behind. The sound of their motorcycles echoed through the parking lot as they sped away, leaving the truck stop in tense silence. Inside, the truckers exchanged wary glances. Mac let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "You think they're gone for good this time?" Ray shook his head. "No, but next time we'll be ready." The sound of the Iron Serpent's motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving the truck stop in a heavy silence. The tension in the room lingered, though the immediate threat had passed. Mac leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing as he watched Ray take a seat again. "They're not done, are they?" Mac asked, his voice low. Ray shook his head. "No. Blade's not the kind of man who lets things go. He's testing us, seeing how far we're willing to stand our ground." Jimmy sat down beside Ray, his jaw tight. "If they come back, it won't be to talk. They'll want to make a statement." Pete, standing behind the counter, wiped his hands nervously on a towel. "I can't run this place with them showing up all the time, scaring off customers. Maybe we should get the police involved." Ray looked at Pete and shook his head gently. "Not yet. The police might escalate things in a way we can't control. Right now, we're handling it on our terms." Lisa approached cautiously, holding a tray of drinks. Her hands were still trembling, but she managed a small smile. "You really think they'll come back?" she asked quietly. Ray gave her a reassuring nod. "If they do, we'll deal with it. You don't need to worry about them." Lisa tried to smile, though the fear in her eyes was evident. Sarah stepped in, placing a comforting hand on Lisa's shoulder. "You let Ray and the boys take care of this," Sarah said. "They've got it under control." Lisa nodded and returned to the kitchen, though she cast one last glance at Ray before disappearing through the door. The truckers exchanged quiet looks, their silent agreement to stand together strengthening with each passing moment. Outside, the Iron Serpents regrouped a few miles down the road. They parked their bikes in a clearing off the highway, their frustration boiling over as Blade paced back and forth. Tank slammed his helmet onto the ground, his face twisted with anger. "That old man and those truckers are making us look weak," Tank growled. "We should have dealt with them right there." Blade turned to face him, his jaw clenched. "We're not finished. This isn't over." Razor, always the cautious one, spoke up. "We're pushing it too far, Blade. Those guys aren't scared of us. If we keep this up, it's only going to get worse." Blade glared at Razor, his eyes narrowing. "You worried about a bunch of truckers, Razor? Since when did the Iron Serpents back down from a fight?" Razor held Blade's gaze for a moment before looking away. I'm just saying, maybe we should think this through. Blade sneered. I've already thought it through. We're going back tonight, and this time we're making sure they remember who we are. The rest of the gang murmured their agreement, though some of them exchanged uneasy glances. Blade's obsession with revenge was starting to push even his most loyal followers to their limits, but none of them dared to voice their concerns. Back at the truck stop, Ray and the others began preparing for the night ahead. The mood was tense but focused as the truckers devised a plan to handle the Iron Serpents if they returned. Max suggested reinforcing the diner's entrances, but Pete shook his head. This place has been open to everyone for years, Pete said. We're not locking the doors now. Jimmy nodded. It's not about locking them out. It's about standing our ground. If they see we're not afraid, they'll think twice before pulling anything. Ray leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. They're coming back. That much is certain. But we've got the advantage. We're united, and we've got each other's backs. That's something they don't have. Mac glanced at the door, his brow furrowed. And if it comes to a fight, Ray's voice was steady. We stand firm. No one acts unless it's absolutely necessary. Violence is their game, not ours. The truckers nodded, their determination evident. They knew the risks, but their loyalty to each other and to the truck stop outweighed their fear. Lisa and Sarah stayed in the kitchen, helping prepare food for the truckers and staff as a way to keep busy and calm their nerves. As night fell, the tension in the diner grew thicker. The truckers took their positions, keeping a close watch on the parking lot. Ray stayed near the counter, his calm presence a source of reassurance for the others. Pete checked the clock repeatedly, muttering under his breath about how quiet the night was. Jimmy broke the silence. It's almost too quiet. Ray glanced out the window, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. They're out there, waiting. And they were. The Iron Serpents had parked their bikes just outside the range of the truck stop's lights, their figures barely visible in the shadows. Blade stood at the front, his expression cold and calculating. This is it, he said to his crew. We go in and we show them who's boss. Tank cracked his knuckles. About time. Razor hesitated but ultimately followed as the gang moved toward the diner. Their footsteps were heavy, their intention clear. Inside, Ray straightened, his gaze fixed on the door. They're here, he said quietly. The truckers rose to their feet, their movements deliberate, calm. Max stood near the door, his arms crossed. Jimmy moved to stand beside Ray, his jaw set. Pete retreated to the kitchen, where Lisa and Sarah waited anxiously. The door creaked open. Blade stepped inside, his crew close behind. He didn't speak immediately, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Ray. You didn't think we'd stay away, did you? Blade said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Ray met his gaze without flinching. I was counting on it. Blade chuckled darkly, taking a step closer. You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that, but guts only get you so far. Ray didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truckers stood behind him, their silent presence a clear message. They weren't going anywhere. Blade's smirk faltered for a moment, but his frustration quickly overtook him. He turned to his crew, nodding toward the truckers. Let's see how tough they really are. Blade's command hung in the air, and the Iron Serpents began to fan out across the diner. Their boots thudded heavily against the floor, and their intimidating presence filled the room. Tank moved to the counter, looming over Pete, who had nervously stepped back from the register. Razor stood near the jukebox, tapping it idly as if he owned the place. The other bikers stood in scattered positions, eyeing the truckers like predators circling their prey. Ray didn't flinch. He stood his ground at the center of the room, his calm gaze locked on Blade. The truckers remained behind him, their quiet confidence unshaken. Mac crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his eyes never leaving Tank. Jimmy stood near the counter, ready to intervene if necessary. Blade smirked, gesturing around the room. What's this? A little trucker army. You think standing together is going to stop us? Ray's voice was steady and deliberate. It's already stopped you twice. I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself again. The truckers chuckled softly at Ray's words, their subtle defiance striking a nerve with Blade. His smirk twisted into a scowl, and he took a step closer to Ray. "You've got a big mouth for an old man," Blade growled, "but you're not as tough as you think." Ray remained unfazed. "And you're not as smart as you think." Attention in the room thickened. Every eye locked on the standoff between Ray and Blade. Tank, growing impatient, slammed his fist on the counter, causing Pete to jump. "Enough talk," Tank bellowed. "We're here to settle this." Jimmy stepped forward, his jaw tight. "If you want to fight, you're going to get more than you bargained for." Tank sneered. "Big words. Let's see if you can back them up." Ray raised a hand, his calm but commanding presence silencing the room. "No one's fighting," he said. His voice carried the weight of authority, and even the bikers hesitated for a moment. Blade narrowed his eyes, studying Ray. "You think you're in charge here, don't you?" He gestured to his crew. "Let's show him how wrong he is." At his signal, Tank grabbed a chair and flung it across the room. The crash of wood splintering against the floor was deafening, and Lisa let out a startled gasp from the kitchen doorway. Pete moved to step forward, but Max stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. Razor moved toward the magazine rack, tossing the neatly arranged books and papers onto the floor. The other bikers joined in, upending tables and knocking over chairs. The destruction was calculated, meant to provoke a reaction. Ray watched silently, his expression unreadable. When Blade stepped closer, Ray's voice cut through the chaos. "You've made your point. Now leave." Blade laughed coldly. "We're just getting started." Jimmy clenched his fists, his frustration evident. "We're not letting them trash this place," he muttered. Ray placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder, stopping him. "Not yet," Ray said quietly. "Let them dig their own grave." Blade seemed to sense the restraint in Ray's words, and it only fueled his arrogance. He stepped right up to Ray, his smirk returning. "What's the matter, hero? Afraid to get your hands dirty?" Ray's voice was calm but firm. "I'm not afraid of anything, but I'm smart enough to know when to act." Blade chuckled, shaking his head. "You're just stalling. You don't have what it takes to stop us." Ray's lips curved into a faint smile. "You'd be surprised." The Iron Serpents continued their rampage, but the truckers didn't waver. They stood their ground, their quiet unity unnerving the bikers more than they cared to admit. Tank, growing frustrated, turned to Blade. "What are we waiting for?" "Let's finish this." Blade hesitated, glancing around the room. Despite their outward confidence, the Iron Serpents were outnumbered, and the truckers' resolve was unshakable the longer the standoff dragged on. The clearer it became that the bikers were losing control of the situation. Finally, Blade sneered and waved a dismissive hand. "Let's go," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "These losers aren't worth it." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, but ultimately followed Blade's lead. They began to back away, their earlier bravado fading. Tank knocked over one last chair as he passed, earning a sharp glare from Mac. Blade stopped at the door, turning back to face Ray. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. Ray met his gaze without flinching. "It is, if you want it to be." Blade's expression darkened, but he didn't reply. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, his crew close behind. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air as they sped away, leaving the truck stop in disarray. Inside, the truckers began picking up the pieces. Chairs were set upright, and magazines were gathered from the floor. Lisa and Sarah emerged from the kitchen, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. Pete approached Ray, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "If they come back again, they won't," Ray interrupted, his voice firm. "Not after tonight." Mac chuckled as he picked up a broken chair. "You've got more faith in them than I do." Ray didn't respond. Instead, he looked out the window, his sharp eyes scanning the dark highway. Something told him this wasn't the last he'd see of Blade and the Iron Serpents. But for now, the truck stop was safe, and that was all that mattered. The truck stop settled into an uneasy calm after the Iron Serpent's latest departure. The truckers continued to clean up the damage, their movements deliberate but silent. Pete swept shards of broken plates into a dustpan, shaking his head. "I've seen my share of rowdy customers," he muttered, "but nothing like this." Jimmy dropped a pile of magazines back onto the rack and sighed. They're not customers. They're vandals, and they'll keep coming back until we make it clear this isn't their playground. Lisa, standing near the counter, glanced nervously at Ray. Do you really think they'll stay away this time? Ray paused, his eyes fixed on the window as though expecting to see the biker's headlights reappear at any moment. No, he said simply. Blade isn't the kind to let things go. He'll be back. The question is when. Sarah patted Lisa's shoulder, her tone both firm and reassuring. Let them come, sweetheart. They'll find out what this place is made of. Lisa nodded hesitantly, though the worry in her eyes lingered. Pete set down his broom and approached Ray. We can't keep going like this, he said. Next time someone could get hurt? Ray turned to Pete, his expression calm but resolute. We'll handle it. As long as we stick together, they don't stand a chance. Mac walked over, his hands on his hips. You really think that gang's gonna back down after all this? Blade's got too much pride to just walk away. Ray nodded. That's what makes him dangerous, but it's also his weakness. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. Weakness. Pride blinds him, Ray explained. He's so focused on proving he's in control that he doesn't see the bigger picture. It'll be his downfall. Truckers exchanged glances, their confidence bolstered by Ray's steady presence. But even as they resumed their cleanup, the tension in the room remained. Everyone knew the Iron Serpents weren't finished, and the next encounter would likely be worse. Meanwhile, Blade and his crew had gathered at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was tense, the biker's earlier bravado replaced with simmering frustration. Tank leaned against his bike, scowling. This is getting old, he grumbled. We show up, and those truckers act like they own the place. It's humiliating. Blade, sitting on a crate with his arms crossed, glared at Tank. You think I don't know that? We've been embarrassed twice because they've got numbers, but this isn't over. Razor spoke up cautiously. Boss, maybe we should let it go. That old man's not backing down, and his crew's tougher than they look. Blade's glare shifted to Razor, his voice icy. You scared of a bunch of truckers, Razor? Razor hesitated, then shook his head. No, just saying we might want to think this through. They're not going to roll over, and the more we push, the more they dig in. Blade stood abruptly, his expression dark. I'm not backing down. This is about respect. We walk away now, and no one will take us seriously again. Ghost, the quietest member of the gang, finally spoke. So what's the plan? You keep saying we're not done, but we can't just keep barging in there. Blade's smirk returned, though it lacked its usual confidence. We'll catch them off guard. Go in late after the place is empty. Make sure they know we can hit them anytime, anywhere. Tank grinned, cracking his knuckles. Now you're talking. Back at the truck stop, the truckers were wrapping up their cleanup efforts. Pete and Lisa worked to straighten the counter area, while Mac and Jimmy moved the last of the overturned chairs back into place. Ray stood near the window, his eyes scanning the parking lot. He could feel the tension building, the calm before the storm. Jimmy joined him, leaning against the wall. You really think they'll try something again tonight? Ray nodded. They will. Blade's too angry to wait. Mac overheard and walked over. Then we'd better be ready. Ray turned to the group, his voice calm but firm. If they come back, we don't engage unless we have to. They want us to react. They want chaos. We're not giving them that. Lisa, overhearing from behind the counter, spoke up hesitantly. But what if they try to hurt someone? What do we do then? Ray looked at her, his expression softening. Then we do what we have to. But we don't go looking for a fight. The truckers nodded, their quiet agreement clear. Pete glanced at the clock on the wall, his brow furrowing. It's getting late, he said. Why don't you all get some rest? I'll keep an eye on things. Ray shook his head. Not a chance. If they're coming back, it'll be after dark. We're staying. Jimmy grinned. Wouldn't feel right leaving you here to handle it alone anyway. Pete sighed, though he didn't argue. He knew the truckers were right. Leaving now would only make them vulnerable. Instead, he headed to the kitchen to check on Lisa and Sarah, who were cleaning up for the night. As the hours ticked by, the truck stop grew quieter. The regulars had left. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for the truckers who had decided to stay. Ray remained by the window, his watchful gaze never wavering. Mac and Jimmy sat at a nearby table, chatting quietly to pass the time. The faint sound of motorcycle engines reached Ray's ears, distant but growing louder. He straightened, his eyes narrowing. "They're here," he said quietly. The truckers immediately sprang into action, their earlier exhaustion replaced with a steely resolve. Mac moved to the door, his broad shoulders blocking the entrance. Jimmy grabbed a nearby chair, turning it around to face the door as he sat down, his arms resting casually on the backrest. Pete emerged from the kitchen, his face pale. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Ray turned to him, his voice calm but firm. "Stay back. Let us handle it." The roar of the motorcycles grew louder, and moments later, the iron serpents pulled into the parking lot. Their bikes lined up in a menacing row, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Blade dismounted first, his expression a mix of anger and determination. The rest of the gang followed, their earlier doubts buried beneath the need to prove themselves. Ray stepped forward, his calm presence unshaken. The truckers fell in behind him, their unity a silent but powerful statement. Blade smirked as he approached the door, his movements deliberate and confident. "Well, well," Blade said as he pushed open the door. "Still standing, huh? Let's see how long that lasts." Blade strode into the diner, his boots echoing against the tile floor. Behind him, the iron serpents followed, their intimidating presence filling the room like a storm cloud. Tank cracked his knuckles, his eyes scanning the truckers, daring anyone to challenge him. Razor and Ghost hung back slightly, their expressions guarded but still projecting confidence. Blade stopped a few feet from Ray, his smirk sharp and mocking. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Blade said, his voice dripping with false amusement. "Here I thought truckers were supposed to be smart." Ray stood his ground, his expression calm and unwavering. "And here I thought bikers knew how to pick their battles." The truckers behind Ray chuckled softly, their quiet unity only fueling Blade's growing frustration. He took another step forward, his smirk fading. "You think this is funny? You think this is a game?" Ray's voice was steady. "It's not a game. It's a warning. You don't belong here, Blade. Walk away while you still can." Blade's jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. Tank moved closer, his massive frame looming over the nearest truckers. "We've had enough of your little speeches," Tank growled. "It's time to show you who's in charge." Mac, standing near the door, crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. "You sure about that? Looks to me like you're already losing." Tank sneered, taking another step forward, but Blade held up a hand, stopping him. "Not yet," Blade said, his eyes never leaving Ray. "I want to hear what the hero has to say." Ray didn't flinch. "There's nothing else to say. You've been warned. The only thing left is for you to decide how this ends." Blade laughed coldly, shaking his head. "You're real confident for someone who's outnumbered." Ray's faint smile was unshaken. "You should count again." Blade glanced around, noticing the truckers slowly moving into position. Jimmy and Mac had shifted slightly, their stances relaxed, but deliberate. Frank, another trucker who had been quietly watching from the corner, stood up, his imposing frame adding to the already formidable wall of solidarity. Even Pete, standing near the counter, seemed less nervous as he watched the unfolding standoff. Blade's smirk faltered for a moment, but his pride refused to let him back down. "Fine," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You want to play tough. Let's see how tough you really are." He turned to Tank and nodded. "Start with him," Blade said, gesturing toward Mac. Tank grinned, stepping forward with a menacing glare. "You've been running your mouth a lot, old man. Let's see if you can back it up." Mac didn't move. His calm demeanor remained intact as he met Tank's gaze without a hint of fear. "You sure you want to do this?" Mac asked, his tone almost casual. Tank didn't answer. He lunged forward, his massive fist swinging toward Mac's jaw, but Mac was quicker than he looked. He sidestepped the punch with surprising agility and delivered a sharp jab to Tank's ribs. Tank stumbled back, his face twisting in pain and surprise. The other truckers tensed, ready to jump in if needed, but Mac held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. "I've got this," he said calmly. Tank growled, charging at Mac again, but this time Jimmy stepped in, grabbing Tank's arm and twisting it behind his back. Tank let out a grunt of pain, struggling against Jimmy's grip, but the smaller man's strength held firm. "That's enough," Ray said, his voice cutting through the commotion like a knife. "This ends now." Blade's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a scowl. "You think this is over?" "We're just getting started." Ray took a step closer to Blade, his calm but commanding presence silencing the room. "It's over when you decide it is. But let me make one thing clear. If you come back here again, you won't just be facing us, you'll be facing the law." Blade's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't dare." Ray's voice was steady. "Try me." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Ray's words hanging heavy in the air. The truckers stood their ground, their united front unshaken. The Iron Serpents exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence crumbling under the pressure. Finally, Blade sneered and gestured to his crew. "Let's go," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "This place isn't worth it." The bikers hesitated but ultimately followed Blade's lead, backing toward the door. Tank glared at Mac and Jimmy as he passed, his pride clearly bruised. Razor and Ghost avoided eye contact, their earlier swagger replaced with quiet unease. Blade paused at the door, turning back to Ray one last time. "You got lucky tonight, old man, but don't think this is the end." Ray's gaze was steady. "You're right. It's not the end, but it's your last warning." Blade didn't reply. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, his crew close behind. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air once again as they sped off into the night. Inside the diner, the truckers let out a collective sigh of relief. Mac adjusted his shirt and grinned. "Guess they're not as tough as they thought." Jimmy chuckled, rubbing his hands together. "That was almost too easy." Pete leaned against the counter, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "I'm just glad it's over." Ray, however, wasn't so sure. He watched the parking lot for a long moment, his sharp instincts telling him that this wasn't the last he'd see of Blade and his gang. For now, though, the truck stop was safe, and that was enough. The truck stop fell into an uneasy calm after the Iron Serpents left. The truckers, though relieved for the moment, stayed on edge. Pete rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered. "They're going to come back. You know that, right?" Ray, still standing near the window, didn't turn around. "They might, but the more they push, the more they realize we won't break." Lisa and Sarah emerged from the kitchen, their faces pale but determined. Lisa approached Ray hesitantly, wringing her hands. "Mr. Carter, do you think they're gone for good?" Ray turned to face her, his calm demeanor steadying her nerves. "No, Lisa. Blade isn't the kind of man who walks away for good, but he's also not as strong as he pretends to be." Jimmy, sitting at the counter, chimed in. "Guys like Blade live off fear. He wants to scare us into backing down. Problem is, fear doesn't work when people stick together." Mac nodded, leaning back in his chair. "And we've shown them we're not scared, not one bit." Lisa managed a small smile, though the tension in her shoulders remained. "I hope you're right." Sarah placed a comforting arm around her. "You let these boys handle the tough stuff. We're safe as long as they're here." Pete, however, wasn't as reassured. What happens when they stop playing games? Next time, they might come back with something more dangerous than fists. Ray's expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Then we deal with it, whatever it takes." Outside, the Iron Serpents had regrouped at their makeshift base, their earlier bravado replaced by frustration and anger. Blade paced in front of his crew, his fists clenched at his sides. "We're not done with them," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Not by a long shot. Tank, still nursing his bruised pride, leaned against his bike. "Then what's the plan? Those truckers aren't backing down, and that old man's got them all riled up." Blade stopped pacing and turned to face him. "We catch them off guard. Hit them when they least expect it." Razor crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "You sure about this, Blade? They've got numbers. And that old guy? He's no pushover." Blade's glare hardened. "Are you saying we can't handle them?" Razor hesitated before shaking his head. "No. I'm saying we need to think this through. If we go back there without a plan, we're gonna get embarrassed again. Blade sneered. That's why we're going back tonight, and this time we're not stopping until they're begging us to leave them alone. The rest of the gang exchanged uneasy glances, but ultimately nodded in agreement. Blade's determination was contagious, even if his obsession with revenge was starting to wear thin on some of them. Back at the truck stop, the truckers began preparing for the night ahead. Ray and Mac discussed potential strategies, their voices low to avoid alarming Pete or the others. We need to be ready for anything, Ray said. If they come back, it won't just be for intimidation. They're looking for a fight. Mac nodded. Agreed. But we've got the advantage. They don't know what we're capable of. Jimmy, who had been listening nearby, leaned in. What about the others? Lisa, Pete, Sarah? They can't be here if things go south. Ray's jaw tightened. We'll move them to the back. Keep them out of harm's way. As the truckers finalized their plan, Lisa approached, her expression hesitant but resolute. What can I do to help? Ray looked at her, his expression softening. You've already done enough, Lisa. Stay in the back with Pete and Sarah. That's the best way to help. Lisa opened her mouth to argue but ultimately nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She disappeared into the kitchen, where Sarah was already gathering supplies to prepare for another long night. As darkness fell, the truck stop grew quieter. The regulars had left, and only a handful of rigs remained in the parking lot. Ray stayed near the window, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The other truckers positioned themselves strategically around the diner, their quiet resolve a testament to their unity. Pete checked the locks on the doors, even though Ray had insisted they remain open. Just in case, Pete said when Ray raised an eyebrow. Jimmy chuckled softly. Guess we're all on edge, huh? Ray didn't respond. His attention was focused on the faint sound of engines in the distance. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the hum of the diner's lights, but as the seconds passed, the sound grew louder, the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles approaching. They're here, Ray said quietly. The truckers immediately sprang into action. Mac moved to the door, his broad shoulders blocking the entrance. Jimmy grabbed a chair, flipping it around and sitting on it backward, his arms resting on the backrest. Pete hurried to the kitchen, where he joined Lisa and Sarah, his face pale but determined. The Iron Serpents pulled into the parking lot, their bikes forming a menacing line. Blade dismounted first, his movements deliberate and confident. The rest of the gang followed suit, their earlier hesitation replaced with renewed determination. Blade pushed open the diner door, his smirk firmly in place. Well, well, he said, his voice carrying a mocking tone. Did you miss us? Ray stepped forward, his calm presence filling the room. Not particularly. Blade's smirk widened. That's too bad, because we're not going anywhere. The truckers rose to their feet one by one, their unity a silent but powerful statement. Mac and Jimmy flanked Ray, their expressions hard and unyielding. Blade's gaze swept over the group, his smirk faltering slightly as he realized just how prepared they were. You don't learn, do you? Ray said, his voice steady. This is your last chance. Turn around and leave. Blade laughed coldly, though the sound lacked conviction. You really think you can scare us? Ray's faint smile returned. I don't need to scare you. I just need to remind you what happens when you push people too far. Blade's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a scowl. Fine, he snarled. Let's see what you've got. Blade's challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud. The Iron Serpents spread out across the diner, their presence overwhelming. Tank stepped forward, his broad shoulders almost blocking the light from the entrance. While Razor moved toward the counter with a smirk, Ghost lingered near the door, his quiet intensity unsettling. Ray stood his ground, his gaze locked on Blade. You don't want this fight, he said, his tone calm but firm. You're outnumbered, and you know it. Blade chuckled, though the sound lacked its usual bravado. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched, he replied. We've handled worse. Jimmy, seated nearby, leaned forward slightly. Not like this, you haven't. The truckers remained steady, their unity a quiet but unmistakable force. Mac shifted his weight, His arms crossed as he watched Tank with sharp eyes. Frank, standing near the jukebox, cracked his knuckles, his imposing frame a silent warning to the bikers. Pete peeked out from the kitchen, his face pale but determined. Lisa and Sarah stood behind him, their expressions a mix of fear and resolve. "Stay back," Pete whispered to them. "Let the guys handle this." Blade stepped closer to Ray, his smirk returning. "You like giving speeches, don't you? Think it makes you look smart?" "Strong." Ray's voice didn't waver. "It's not about looking strong. It's about standing for what's right." Blade sneered. "That's cute. Let's see how far that gets you." Tank moved suddenly, grabbing a chair and flinging it across the room. It smashed against the wall, the sound reverberating through the diner. Lisa let out a small gasp from the kitchen doorway, and Pete instinctively moved to block her view. Ray didn't flinch. He raised a hand, signaling the truckers to hold their positions. "That's enough," he said, his voice sharp. "If you're trying to scare us, it's not working." Tank sneered, his fists tightening. "Oh, I'm just getting started." Blade held up a hand, stopping Tank in his tracks. "Easy," he said, his tone low. "No need to rush." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. Ray remained calm, his steady presence keeping the truckers focused. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his muscles tense. Mac adjusted his stance, his gaze never leaving Tank. Blade took another step toward Ray, his smirk now a thin line of frustration. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, old man. Just back down, and we'll leave." Ray's eyes narrowed. "You've said that before, and yet here you are." The other truckers chuckled softly, their quiet defiance further agitating Blade. He clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. "Fine," he growled. "If you want to play it this way, let's see how tough you really are." At his signal, Tank lunged forward, aiming a punch at Mac. But Mac was ready. He sidestepped the blow with surprising agility and countered with a solid shove, sending Tank stumbling backward. Jimmy moved in quickly, grabbing Tank by the arm and twisting it behind his back. Tank let out a grunt of pain, struggling against Jimmy's grip. The other bikers hesitated, their earlier bravado faltering. Razor moved toward Ray, but Frank intercepted him, stepping in with a sharp warning. "Don't," Frank said simply, his deep voice carrying a weight that stopped Razor in his tracks. Blade watched the scene unfold, his frustration mounting. "You think this is over?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the commotion. "We're not done." Ray stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You are. You just don't know it yet." Blade's scowl deepened, but he didn't move. He glanced around the room, taking in the unyielding stance of the truckers. They weren't scared, they weren't backing down, and for the first time, Blade seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. Tank, still held firmly by Jimmy, growled through gritted teeth. "Boss, what do we do?" Blade hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of their position. Finally, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You win this round." Jimmy released Tank, who staggered back with a glare. The other bikers began retreating, their earlier confidence now replaced with quiet frustration. Blade lingered for a moment longer, his gaze locked on Ray. "This isn't over," Blade said, his tone low and threatening. Ray's response was measured. "It is if you want it to be." Blade didn't reply. He turned on his heel and strode toward the door, his crew following close behind. The sound of their motorcycles roared to life as they sped off into the night, leaving the truck stop in tense silence. Inside, the truckers exchanged relieved glances. Max straightened his shirt with a wry smile. "Guess they're not as tough as they thought." Jimmy chuckled, rubbing his shoulder. "Still, they're persistent. I'll give them that." Pete emerged from the kitchen, his face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked quietly. Ray watched the horizon for a long moment before answering. "If they do, we'll be ready." Lisa approached cautiously, her voice hesitant. "Are you sure we can keep handling this?" Ray turned to her, his expression softening. "We can. As long as we stick together, there's nothing they can do to break us." Lisa managed a small smile, her confidence slowly returning. The truckers began to settle back into their seats, their unity stronger than ever. For now, the truck stop was safe, but everyone knew the Iron Serpents weren't finished, and when they returned, the truckers would be ready. The truck stop returned to an uneasy calm after the Iron Serpents roared away. Chairs were uprighted again, broken glass swept into piles, and the truckers resumed their quiet camaraderie. Despite the relief, no one could shake the feeling that this wasn't the last they'd see of Blade and his gang. Lisa wiped down the counter, her hands still trembling slightly. "It feels like they're testing us," she said softly, her eyes darting toward Ray. Ray nodded as he helped Pete stack chairs against the far wall. "They are," he said. "Blade wants control. Every time we stand up to him, it chips away at the image he's built for himself. He won't stop until he either wins or realizes he can't." Jimmy leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. "Then we've got to make it real clear he can't win. Next time he shows up, we don't hold back." Mac grunted in agreement. "We can't let them think they've got a shot at running this place. If we push them hard enough, they'll eventually break." Ray set a chair down and straightened, his calm gaze sweeping across the room. "It's not about pushing. It's about standing firm. If we let them drag us into their game, we lose, no matter what." Truckers nodded, their respect for Ray evident in their quiet agreement. He had become their de facto leader, a steadying presence in the storm the Iron Serpents had brought to their doorstep. Even Pete, who had initially been hesitant to stand up to the gang, seemed more resolute. "They're cowards," Pete said, his voice firmer than before. "They only act tough when they think no one will fight back, and they've never faced anyone like us." Mac added, crossing his arms. "Let them come. We'll show them what this place is made of." Meanwhile, miles away at the gang's hideout, Blade's frustration reached its boiling point. He paced back and forth in the dimly lit space, his crew watching him in tense silence. Tank sat on a battered crate, nursing his bruised pride. Razor leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while Ghost quietly tinkered with a knife, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," Blade growled, his fists clenched. "They think they can embarrass us, make us look weak. We'll show them exactly who they're dealing with." Tank finally spoke up, his voice rough. "Then what's the plan, boss? We've gone in twice and they haven't budged. If we go back without something new, we're just spinning our wheels." Blade stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "We hit them harder, smarter. Catch them when they least expect it." Razor frowned. "They're ready for us, Blade. Every time we show up, they're standing there like they've been waiting all night." Blade turned sharply, his glare cutting through Razor's words. "Then we make sure they're not ready. We go in fast and hit them where it hurts." Ghost spoke for the first time, his voice low and measured. "And if they fight back," Blade sneered, "then we remind them who we are." At the truck stop, the truckers were settling in for what they knew would be another long night. The sense of community was stronger than ever, and even the tension seemed lighter as they shared stories and jokes over coffee. Lisa and Sarah brought out plates of food, their smiles more genuine now that they had seen what the truckers were capable of. "You know," Lisa said as she placed a plate of eggs in front of Jimmy, "I think you might actually scare them." Jimmy grinned, taking a bite. "I hope so. They need to know they're messing with the wrong group." Mac chuckled from across the room. "Let's just hope they're smart enough to figure it out before they get themselves hurt." Ray, sitting in the window, kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. He listened to the chatter around him, his calm presence grounding the group, but in the back of his mind, he knew Blade wasn't finished. Men like him didn't back down easily, especially when their pride was on the line. As the hours ticked by, the truckers grew quieter, their anticipation mounting. Pete checked the clock repeatedly, muttering under his breath. "If they're coming, it'll be soon." Lisa approached Ray, her voice low. "What do you think they'll do?" Ray's response was measured. "They'll try to catch us off guard, make us feel like we're not safe here." Lisa frowned. "And are we?" Ray glanced at her, his calm gaze steady. "As long as we're together." "Yes." The sound of distant engines broke the quiet. the low rumble cutting through the stillness of the night. The truckers exchanged knowing looks, their earlier chatter replaced by a focused determination. Ray stood, his movements deliberate, and the others followed suit. "They're here," Mac said, his voice low. The Iron Serpents pulled into the parking lot once again, their bikes forming a menacing line. Blade dismounted first, his face set with grim determination. Tank and the others followed, their earlier hesitation replaced with a renewed sense of purpose. Inside, the truckers took their positions, their unity a silent but unmistakable statement. Max stood near the door, his broad shoulders blocking part of the entrance. Jimmy remained at the counter, his hands resting casually on the back of a chair. Ray stayed near the window, his sharp eyes never leaving Blade. The door creaked open, and Blade stepped inside, his smirk returning as he surveyed the room. "Did you miss us?" he said, his voice laced with mockery. Ray stepped forward, his calm presence filling the room. "Not at all," he replied evenly. "But I'm starting to wonder how many times you need to lose before you get the message." Blade's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Lose? You think we're losing?" "No, old man, we're just getting started." Ray's voice was steady. "Then this is where it ends." Blade's smirk twisted into a sneer. "You really think you've got us beat? You're just a bunch of truckers playing tough. We're the Iron Serpents, and we don't back down." Ray stepped closer, his calm presence unshaken by Blade's posturing. "Maybe that's your problem," he said. "You don't know when to stop, even when you're out of your depth." The truckers silently moved into position, their unity an unspoken message to the bikers. This wasn't a battle they could win. Max stood tall by the door, his arms crossed like an immovable wall. Jimmy adjusted his stance, his eyes fixed on Tank, who seemed ready to pounce. Frank took up position near the counter, his imposing frame a quiet warning to the bikers lingering near the booths. Blade's eyes darted around the room, his confidence wavering as he realized just how prepared the truckers were. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You think standing together makes you strong," he spat. "All it means is you'll fall together." Ray didn't flinch. "Standing together is exactly what makes us strong. And if you'd learned that, you wouldn't be leading a pack of men into battles you can't win." Tank growled, stepping forward. "Enough talk. Let's settle this." Before he could move, Mac raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Don't. You've already embarrassed yourself twice. Don't make it worse." Tank hesitated, his anger clashing with the reality of Mac's words. Even he could see the truth. Every move they'd made had been met with unyielding resistance. Blade, however, wasn't ready to let go. "You don't scare me," he snarled at Ray. "None of you do." Ray took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice was low, but carried the weight of authority. "We don't need to scare you. You've already lost, and every time you come back you'll lose again." The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado cracking under the pressure of the truckers' unshakable resolve. Razor, always the most cautious, stepped closer to Blade. "Boss," he muttered, his voice low. "Maybe it's time to call it. This isn't going anywhere." Blade shot Razor a sharp glare, but the murmurs of agreement from the other bikers told him that his crew was losing faith. Even Tank, who had been the loudest advocate for confrontation, seemed less certain. Ray didn't wait for Blade to respond. "This is your last chance," he said. "Leave, now, and don't come back." Blade hesitated, his pride and his fear warring within him. Finally, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "You win this time." He turned sharply, signaling his crew to follow. The Iron Serpents began filing out, their earlier menace replaced by quiet frustration. Tank shot one last glare at Mac as he passed, but he didn't say a word. Blade stopped at the door, looking back at Ray with a smirk that barely hid his defeat. "You think you've seen the last of us, old man." Ray's calm gaze didn't waver. "I know I have, because if you come back, you won't just be dealing with us. You'll be dealing with the law." Blade's smirk faltered, but he didn't reply. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, his crew following close behind. The roar of their motorcycles faded into the night, leaving the truck stop in tense silence. Inside, the truckers slowly began to relax. Mac leaned against the wall, letting out a low chuckle. Guess they finally got the message. Jimmy nodded, his shoulders easing as he sat down. Took them long enough. Pete emerged from the kitchen, his face a mix of exhaustion and relief. You think they're really gone this time? Ray turned from the window, his gaze softening. They are. Blade knows he can't win here. He just needed to see it for himself. Lisa and Sarah stepped out cautiously, their expressions lightening as they saw the truckers beginning to smile. Lisa approached Ray, her voice hesitant. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Ray gave her a small nod. "You don't need to thank me. This place is a community. We protect each other." Sarah patted Lisa on the back, her voice warm. "He's right, and we're lucky to have him." The truckers began putting the diner back in order, their laughter and banter returning as the weight of the night lifted. Mac clapped Ray on the shoulder as he passed. "You know, you've got a knack for leadership. Ever think about running for mayor?" Ray chuckled. "I'll stick to trucking." Jimmy raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To Ray, and to keeping this place ours." The other truckers echoed the sentiment, their camaraderie filling the room with warmth. The iron serpents were gone, their hold over the truck stop broken for good, and as Ray watched the horizon, he knew that no matter what challenges came their way, this community would stand together, unshaken and unbreakable. This story reminds us that courage and unity can stand against even the toughest challenges. Ray's calm strength and the community's solidarity teach us the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against us. If you enjoyed this tale of bravery and karma, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching.